Between 1930 and 1940, more than 400 Mafia-related murders ripped through the streets of Brooklyn, Cleveland, Detroit, and a dozen other American cities. Most of the victims were gangsters, informants, or union organizers who had crossed the wrong people. But here's the chilling part. Almost none of these killings were committed out of passion, revenge, or territory. They were jobs, carried out by a crew of young men who treated murder the way most people treated a paycheck. This was Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the Mafia. A mixed crew of Jewish and Italian killers who answered not to one Mafia family, but to the commission itself. When Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, or Lepke Buchholzer needed someone eliminated, quietly, efficiently, permanently, they called these men. And the man they called most often was a 20-something from Brownsville, Brooklyn, who dressed like a movie star and killed with the cold precision of a surgeon. His name was Harry Strauss. The newspapers called him Pittsburgh Phil. His friends called him Pep. His victims, if they had time to realize what was happening, called him nothing at all. He was linked to at least 100 murders. Some accounts put the number closer to 500. He used ice picks, ropes, hammers, fire extinguishers, whatever was at hand. He once told a fellow killer that his favorite part of his job was reading the newspaper the next morning and learning that his work had made the coroner vomit. How did a Jewish immigrant kid from a Brownsville tenement become the deadliest contract killer in American history? How did murdering operate in plain sight for nearly a decade? And why, when the law finally closed in, did the most feared hitman in New York City walk calmly into the electric chair without a fight? Once they send Pittsburgh Phil for you, your fate is sealed. This is the story of the many murders of Pittsburgh Phil, the Mafia's most prolific killer. Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss was born Harry Ostrovsky on July 28, 1909 in the city of Berdichev in present-day Ukraine, but was back at the time of Harry's birth part of the Russian Empire. His parents, of whom no photographs survive, were Jacob and Edith Ostrovsky, a Jewish couple trying to raise a family in a place where their very identity as Jews put a target on their backs. Harry was the youngest of 4 children, and on paper, he was just another child born into a working-class Jewish household. In reality, he was born into a world already shaped by fear, violence, and discrimination. By the time Harry's parents were born in the 1880s, Berdichev had become one of the largest Jewish population centers in the Russian Empire. It was a crowded, intensely Jewish city where Jewish families filled the markets, workshops and small businesses, and where daily life revolved around communal institutions that had existed for generations. Berdichev was often referred to as the Jerusalem of Volhynia, Volhynia being a huge historic region in Eastern Europe, and Berdichev being a city defined by the scale and density of its Jewish life. But that vibrancy existed alongside a constant sense of vulnerability. In the Russian Empire in the early 20th century, Jews were tolerated rather than accepted. Russian rulers inherited centuries-old religious prejudice from the Orthodox Church, which cast Jews as permanent outsiders. That suspicion was formalized in law. Most Jews were restricted to living within a vast border region in the empire's west, an area known as the Pale of Settlement, and were barred from settling freely elsewhere. For families like the Ostrovskys, life inside the Pale meant permanent limitation. Jews faced restrictions on where they could live, what professions they could enter, and how they could educate their children. Economic pressure was constant, but worse was the knowledge that legal protection was fragile at best. Violence could arrive without warning. Organized attacks on Jewish neighborhoods, known as pogroms, had already swept through towns across the region by the time that Jacob and Edith had reached adulthood. Homes were looted, synagogues destroyed, and families beaten or killed, often with little or no intervention from authorities. By the early 20th century, those outbreaks were becoming more frequent and more brutal. Each political crisis, each rumour of war or economic downturn carried with it the risk that Jewish communities would once again be singled out. Life in places like Berdichev grew increasingly precarious, defined by uncertainty rather than stability. By the time Harry was 5 years old in 1914, with the First World War just beginning and persecution worsening, the message to Jews like the Ostrovskys was unmistakable. Stay in Berdichev and risk your life, or leave and you might have a chance at survival. They chose to leave, joining the more than 2 million Jews who fled the Russian Empire at the turn of the 20th century. Some went to Western Europe, Palestine and South America. The majority, however, aimed for America, where approximately 1.5 million arrived. Families packed onto trains heading west to major ports like Hamburg, Bremen, Antwerp and Rotterdam. From there, they boarded steamships bound for the Atlantic crossing, crammed into steerage compartments where conditions were crowded and unsanitary, food was basic, privacy was non-existent, and disease spread quickly among families already weakened by the journey. After weeks at sea, the first sign of America finally appeared on the horizon, the Statue of Liberty. And like millions of immigrants before them, the Ostrovskys stood on deck and watched her rise from the mist, a towering promise that life might be better than the one they had fled. For a moment, their hearts filled with hope. But for most newcomers, that hope was short-lived. Every immigrant ship was funneled to Ellis Island, the federal processing centre that handled more than 12 million arrivals. And it was not a place of welcome, it was a place of examination. Families were herded into cavernous halls beneath harsh lights, subjected to rapid-fire medical inspections, legal interrogations, and hours, sometimes days, of waiting. Doctors marked the sick with chalk on their coats. Those who failed basic health checks were pulled aside, detained, or separated from their families. A small number were sent back across the ocean entirely. For the rest, Ellis Island was their first lesson in America. The journey wasn't over. The struggle had only shifted locations. For most Jewish immigrants, New York was both the destination and the prison. Too poor to travel inland, they remained in the city. Jewish neighborhoods formed across the Lower East Side of Manhattan, Brownsville and Williamsburg in Brooklyn, and parts of Harlem, becoming tight-knit Yiddish-speaking enclaves. Within them, residents built synagogues, newspapers, unions, and mutual aid societies, fragile safety nets in a city that did not care whether they sank or survived. When the Ostrovskys arrived, they did what many immigrants did. They changed their name to fit in. Ostrovsky became Strauss. It didn't erase their past, but it made life a little easier on farms, at factories, and with landlords. Like many Jewish families at the time, they settled in the Bronx, moving into a modest apartment at 1364 Brook Avenue. Harry's father, Jacob, found steady work as a harness maker at a warehouse on St. Anne's Avenue, a short walk from the family home. Documents like the Ostrovsky census always existed, but accessing them once required time, effort, and physical presence. That barrier is now gone. Today, that anonymity is almost impossible, and speaking to you from here, letting you have a peek behind the curtain, I know that better than most because everything we do online leaves a footprint, and that's why I personally use today's sponsor, private internet access. I started using PIA simply because the amount of research I do for these documentaries whilst on the move, using public Wi-Fi, hotel networks, uploading large files, logging into my 20 different Ancestry and New York Times accounts, and I wanted something reliable that I didn't have to think about. Once it's on, and more than once it has saved me from sketchy websites when I'm cross-referencing my facts. Private internet access is a VPN, which means that it encrypts your internet connection and hides your IP address, protecting your data from hackers, internet providers, and anyone else tracking what you're doing online. They have a strict no-logs policy that's been proven in court, servers in over 90 countries and all 50 US states, and you can protect an unlimited number of devices with just one subscription. It also lets you access region-restricted content, so for example, a lot of classic crime and mafia documentaries are available on US Netflix but not anywhere else. With PIA, you can simply switch your location to the US and watch them as if you were there. Right now, you can get private internet access for just $2.03 a month, plus 4 extra months by using my link, piavpn.com/The Last Supper. There's also a 30-day money-back guarantee, meaning you can try it right now for a month completely risk-free, and I couldn't recommend it enough. But now, let's get back to the many murders of Pittsburgh Phil. The Brook Avenue neighborhood was not wealthy, but compared to what the family had known in Berdichev, it represented a step up. The buildings were newer, the streets slightly wider, and the overcrowding less extreme than in many downtown tenements. For a brief period, it appeared they had done what they set out to do, escape the worst of the old world and carve out something better in the new. Then, in 1916, it all collapsed. On November the 28th, 1916, Harry's father Jacob was involved in an industrial accident at work. He was rushed to Lebanon Hospital in the Bronx, but the injuries were too severe and he died there. Edith was left a widow with several children to feed in a country that offered no safety net and no one to fall back on. And Harry, the youngest, was just 7 years old. But tragedy did not stop there, because 2 years later, Harry's brother Hyman died at Mount Sinai Hospital at the age of 16. The exact cause was never clearly recorded, but the consequences were clear enough. Another devastating loss, another fracture in a family already struggling to survive. Still reeling from Hyman's death and now without Jacob's income, the family could no longer afford to remain on Brook Avenue. Rent still had to be paid, food still had to be put on the table. With no safety net to fall back on, Edith was forced to make a decision. And like countless immigrant mothers before her, she chose the only option within reach. So she decided to move the family 20 miles south from the Bronx to Brownsville, settling at 574 Vermont Street, a modest working-class row house just off Livonia Avenue, tucked inside one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. And to say that Brownsville was a whole different world would be an understatement. By the time that the Strausses finally arrived, Brownsville was one of the most overcrowded and poorest neighborhoods in New York City. Tenement buildings were old, badly maintained, and crammed full of families. Hallways were narrow and dark, ventilation was poor, and in summer, apartments turned into ovens. In winter, they were freezing. Compared to the newer 5- and 6-story buildings around Brook Avenue, Brownsville was a step down in almost every way. But it was cheap, and that was all that mattered. On the streets, another reality waited. Like many poor immigrant neighborhoods at the time, Brownsville had a thriving street culture, and a lot of it revolved around gangs. Groups of teenage boys formed loose crews for protection, for petty theft, for control of corners, and for pushcart routes. Shopkeepers dealt with constant harassment, theft, and demands for money. Police presence was thin and often corrupt. For kids, the streets were both a playground and a battleground. Fights were common, rivalries formed quickly, small-time hustles like stealing, running errands for older criminals, acting as lookouts, they all became part of daily life. School, when it was attended at all, competed with the pull of the streets, and this was the world that shaped young Harry. He had come from a family that had escaped one kind of violence in Europe, only to be dropped into a different kind in New York. The combination of a fatherless home, crushing poverty, and a neighborhood where toughness was the currency did what it often did in places like Brownsville. It pushed boys toward the only structure that seemed to offer power, money, and a kind of respect: the gangs. Harry's mother managed to find work as a finisher in the garment industry. She was employed at Pollock & Feldman at 158 West 29th Street in Manhattan, far from Brownsville, deep in the Midtown garment district. The commute was long, the hours even longer, and it meant that Harry spent much of his childhood left to fend for himself. With his father and brother gone, Harry saw firsthand what survival meant: long hours, low pay, and no guarantees. Watching his mother struggle to hold the family together, he came to believe early on that his future wasn't going to follow the ordinary path laid out for boys like him. Regardless though, for now, he obeyed his mother's wishes and followed his remaining siblings into enrolling at the massive Public School 109, a hulking building that once spanned an entire block on Dumont Avenue. The school is now long gone, replaced by the Van Dyke houses, but in its day, it was one of the most overcrowded public schools in Brooklyn. Built in 1907 to accommodate the flood of Jewish immigrants pouring into the neighborhood, PS 109 was a direct response to a population boom that saw Brownsville's Jewish community swell from 10,000 in 1904 to over 60,000 by the time that 9-year-old Harry enrolled in 1918. And it was within those crowded halls of PS 109 that Harry would meet the boys who would one day grow up to become the most feared band of killers in New York City. Among the boys he met were two older kids who also lived off Livonia Avenue and often walked home with him: Abe Rellis and Martin Bugsy Goldstein, nicknamed for being crazy as a bedbug. Both were Brooklyn born, both drawn to the same thrill of rebellion and ambition that Harry also carried with him. They became fast companions in and out of class, bunking off school, running errands, loitering on corners, and dreaming of a life bigger than what the tenements had to offer. Textbooks never stood a chance. Teachers remembered Harry as sharp-eyed and intelligent, a boy who clearly had ability but little patience for the classroom. He rarely applied himself, often distracted, restless, and uninterested in lessons that felt disconnected from the world waiting for him outside. By his early teens, the pull of the streets was already stronger than the dull routine of school. The neighborhood offered fast money, older role models, and a sense of belonging that textbooks never could. In 1924, at the age of 14, Harry Strauss followed Abe and Bugsy and dropped out of PS 109 for good. Finally giving in to the allure of the streets of Brownsville, Harry started the way that most young criminals did, as a small-time thief. Along with Abe and Bugsy, Harry fell in with the Brownsville Boys, one of the neighborhood's most notorious juvenile gangs. Their endeavors were petty, lifting from pushcarts, picking pockets, running errands for the older gangsters who ran the local rackets. But for boys like them, it wasn't just mischief, it was a doorway, the first step into a darker, wider world that they were destined to thrive in. But little did they know that the Brownsville Boys weren't just another gang, they were a pipeline, a street-hardened finishing school for organised crime. Among their ranks were teens with names that would soon echo across the underworld: Albert Tannenbaum, Seymour Magoon, and Mendy Weiss. They were already running rackets, collecting money, and walking the neighborhood with a confidence that came from knowing who was afraid of them. For Harry, Abe and Bugsy, these weren't just older kids. They were proof that if you were tough enough, smart enough and cruel enough, you could claw your way out of the tenements and row houses and take exactly what it was that you wanted. Most of Harry's friends called him Pep, short for Pepper, which was early 20th slang for someone hot-tempered and quick to react, like the spice itself. But with the money he made running jobs with the Brownsville boys, Harry started dressing like he had something to prove and soon picked up a new nickname. Whilst the other boys spent their money on liquor, gambling and whatever pleasures the street had to offer, Harry spent his on tailored suits, polished shoes and crisp collars, the sharpest look that a street kid could buy, and that's when Pittsburgh Phil started to stick. Not because he'd ever been to Pittsburgh, but because he reminded people of the famous 19th century gambler, slick, stylish, and always looking for the next score. Harry understood that image mattered. With the way that he dressed, Harry made sure that you remembered him, and people did. He was tall, handsome, and moved with the kind of confidence that turned heads. In Brownsville, he quickly gained a reputation as a womanizer, long before he gained any other. But that wasn't what history would remember him for. In the years that followed, the petty thief from Brownsville, the sharp dresser, the charmer, the boy whose teachers had once thought he had potential, would carve out a far darker place for himself. He would become known not for fashion or for flirtation, but for something that stunned even the hardest criminals in New York, a chilling, emotionless talent for murder, and history was about to hand him the perfect stage. On January the 20th, 1920, America tried something bold and, in hindsight, something disastrous.
World War I is over, and so are America's days of legal alcoholic drink. Convinced self-sacrifice and sobriety will bring prosperity and peace. As it won victory in war, Americans praise passing of the dry law.
With the passage of a law called the Volstead Act, the United States officially banned the manufacture, sale and transportation of alcohol. It was the beginning of Prohibition, a nationwide effort to stamp out drinking in hopes of creating a cleaner, safer society. But the plan backfired almost immediately. People didn't stop drinking, they just stopped doing it legally. Almost overnight, a black market was born, and in cities like New York, bars went underground and became secret clubs, now called speakeasies. Trucks that once used to deliver ice, milk and other essentials now moved illegal booze. And gangs that had once scraped by on pickpocketing and protection rackets suddenly found themselves at the centre of a booming, dangerous and incredibly profitable new business. When Prohibition began, the Brownsville boys went to work for the men who already controlled the neighbourhood's criminal economy, the Shapiro brothers of Brooklyn, Meyer, Irving and Willie. They were three ruthless Jewish siblings, sons of Russian Jewish immigrants, whose path to America closely mirrored Harry's own. Like the Ostrovskys, their parents had fled the Russian Empire in 1905 and arrived in Brooklyn just a few months later. In East New York, a Brooklyn district bordering Brownsville and sharing its dense Jewish immigrant streets, the family settled into a modest house at 691 Blake Avenue had become the headquarters of their expanding rackets. By then, the Shapiros were deeply entrenched in bootlegging, illegal gambling, labour racketeering, truck hijacking and protection schemes across Brownsville and East New York. They controlled liquor storage, delivery routes, speakeasies, trucking crews and gambling dens. Nothing moved through their territory without their approval. Prohibition had handed organised crime the opportunity of a lifetime. The liquor trade was booming, the money was flowing, and the Shapiros needed help. Their growing empire demanded more muscle, loyal young enforcers who knew the streets and could follow orders. In early 1924, they found what they were looking for in the Brownsville boys. The boys were exactly the kind of tough, ambitious foot soldiers the brothers needed to protect shipments, settle disputes and keep their rivals in line. The Brownsville boys blended into that structure the way the young street crews always did, at the bottom. They guarded trucks, moved stolen liquor, collected small debts, stole shipments, and enforced orders when needed. It was dangerous work, but it paid better than factory wages and came with the protection of men whose names carried weight on the streets. Now working full-time in the Shapiro's rackets, Abe Rellis eventually got pinched while carrying out a theft job and was sentenced to 2 years at Sing Sing prison, the first real taste of prison for any of the Brownsville boys, and a sobering reminder of the risks that came with their rising status. While Rellis served his sentence, the rest of the crew kept working for the Shapiros, running liquor to speakeasies, shaking down local shops, and enforcing street-level rackets. Speakeasies were illegal bars hidden behind storefronts, barbershops or basements where flappers danced, jazz blazed and bootleg liquor flowed freely. They were the beating heart of Prohibition nightlife, and for crews like the Brownsville boys, they were also opportunity. When Rellis got out in 1926, he rejoined Bugsy Goldstein and Harry with a new plan. Since they were already making regular booze drop-offs, they started delivering something else: slot machines. Quietly and quickly, they built an off-the-books gambling racket, placing machines in the very speakeasies that they were supplying the Shapiro brothers' booze to, then collecting the cash on return runs. The operation grew fast. Too fast. The money rolled in, but so did the risk. They were collecting profits on Shapiro turf without Shapiro approval. And in that world, that kind of trespass didn't just earn you a warning, it earned you a funeral. But the Brownsville boys weren't alone anymore, because behind the scenes, they had made a new and dangerous connection. One that would change everything. The boys were making real money, and that attracted the man they called the accountant of the mob, Meyer Lansky, already one of the most powerful mobsters in New York City, the right hand of rising star Lucky Luciano. Lansky wasn't a street gangster, he was a strategist and a money man, quietly building a syndicate-wide network of gambling operations alongside liquor smuggling rackets. What he wanted was access to the poorer neighborhoods of Brooklyn, where slot machines, policy games, and underground gambling flourished among people desperate for quick money. Lansky saw potential in the Brownsville boys and financed them with his bootlegging millions to expand further. But he took a cut. As Lansky's influence expanded into Brownsville, East New York, and Ocean Hill, so did their confidence. With Lansky, and by extension Lucky Luciano backing them, the Brownsville boys now felt protected from immediate retaliation. With that protection in place, the Brownsville boys grew bolder. They continued placing slot machines deeper into Shapiro-controlled blocks, openly skimming profits that once flowed upwards to the brothers. And just as importantly, they began expanding beyond slots. From gambling, they moved into loan sharking, craps games, and labor racketeering, using intimidation and violence to enforce payments and control workers. What began as petty theft had now evolved into organized crime. They were no longer just street kids running errands, they were building a criminal operation of their own. One powerful enough to challenge the men who once owned them. With money now flowing and protection behind them, the crew needed more than thieves and collectors. They needed men who could enforce their will without hesitation. Men who could kill if necessary. The Brownsville boys' ranks swelled, and boy, did they start killing. They began to gather a reputation for ruthlessness. During their rise up the criminal underworld, transitioning from working under the Shapiros to working for Lansky, they ran into plenty of adversaries. Sometimes it was a speakeasy owner who wouldn't let them install a slot machine. Other times it was a loan sharking client who borrowed money but couldn't pay it back. And occasionally the call came straight from Meyer Lansky himself, asking for a favor. The fact that the New York Mafia would turn to a crew of 20 and 21-year-olds for contract killings said everything about how effective and feared they'd now become. By 1928, 22-year-old Abe Relis had already killed approximately 6 men. He was the only one who'd done serious jail time, and he was the oldest of the crew. Relis was the natural leader, the one who spoke to Lansky and his top men, and who oversaw their most serious work. He particularly enjoyed using a length of rope to garrote his victims, a method that earned him the nickname Kid Twist, a name shared with an earlier New York gangster, Max Verbock, who was also known for killing his victims with a rope. But all of the Brownsville boys were stone-cold killers by the time that they were barely out of their teens. Bugsy Goldstein was another formidable assassin, the one most often dispatched when Lansky needed someone eliminated. Living up to his nickname, Bugsy liked to crack jokes before pulling the trigger, often saying things like, "You need me like a hole in the head," just before putting a bullet in his target's skull. Albert Tannenbaum was also cut from the same cloth. Like Bugsy, he handled high-level hits for Lansky and earned the nickname TikTok after completing one mob hit just 10 minutes after getting the call. Mendy Weiss and Seymour Magoon looked after the loan sharking side of the business. Mendy was one of Lansky's most trusted men and was frequently deployed in labor racketeering operations. Magoon, meanwhile, was known as Blue Jaw because his stubble was so thick it looked like he needed another shave 5 minutes after the first. The other Brownsville boys mocked him for it, most of them too young to grow proper facial hair. But out of all of them, Harry, by now widely known as Pittsburgh Phil, not just within his own crew but across much of Brooklyn, had already begun to stand apart. Harry was more than just an assassin, he was a professional and he enjoyed it. As time went by, his skills became so known and respected in the underworld that he did hits all across the country. Despite getting arrested a couple of times, he managed to avoid prison every single time. The reason for Harry's successful avoidance of conviction was simple. He had a strict personal rule: he never carried a gun, period, and he never carried a weapon unless he was about to use it. For the vast majority of killings, Harry used whatever was immediately available in his vicinity: a length of pipe, heavy chain torn from a bicycle, even a fire extinguisher on one occasion. If cops found him, he made sure no evidence was on him or around him. But above all the listed weapons, Harry's preferred weapon was the ice pick. In the years before refrigeration, the ice pick was a common household tool, used daily to break down blocks of ice, and it drew little attention if carried or discarded. Contemporary investigators and later law enforcement sources acknowledged that Strauss used the ice pick with such precision, a surgical strike to the brain, that some of his victims were initially ruled to have died of natural causes like brain hemorrhages. At a time when forensic medicine was limited and post-mortem examinations were often brief and inconsistent, those deaths passed without immediate suspicion, one of the reasons Harry was able to kill repeatedly without conviction. By the early 1930s, a combination of events finally gave Harry Strauss the platform to do what he did best, and set him on the path to becoming one of the most prolific contract killers the American underworld would ever produce. The friction between the Brownsville boys and the Shapiro brothers was slowly turning into open war. The Shapiros, despite still owning a lot of territory across Brooklyn, saw the crew that once worked under them now surpassing them, and the brothers felt that they should be getting a cut of the money that the mob were now getting from the boys' rackets. The Shapiros also understood that the boys were no longer street-level thieves. They were becoming the operational core of a rival organisation, and if they weren't eliminated, they would eventually take everything. Despite the Brownsville boys being protected by Meyer Lansky himself, the Shapiros decided to go on the offensive, thinking they could take them out, and thus a war for Brownsville began. Both sides began trading shootings over gambling routes, extortion lines, and control of Brownsville. During the early phase of the war, Relis and Bugsy were lured into what they believed was a routine meeting inside Shapiro-controlled territory. But It was a setup. Shapiro gunmen opened fire at close range, riddling both men with bullets. By sheer luck, Relis and Goldstein were wounded but survived, managing to escape with their lives. From that moment on, the war shifted from business to extermination. But the Brownsville boys were not the only enemies that the Shapiros had made. In their push to consolidate gambling territory and control trucking routes, the brothers had also crossed the path of a far more dangerous opponent, Louis Lepke Buchalter. By this point, Lepke was no street gangster. By the early 1930s, he was already one of the most powerful racketeers in New York, controlling huge sections of the garment industry, trucking unions, bakeries, and factory labor contracts. While the Shapiros ran bootlegging, gambling, and street rackets in Brownsville and East New York, Lepke controlled entire industries. And when the Shapiros began interfering with trucking operations and labor crews tied to his rackets, they crossed a line he didn't tolerate. To Lepke, this wasn't competition. It was a direct threat to his business. He made a decision. The Shapiro brothers had to be removed, and their removal had to send a message. Lepke quietly put out bounties on all three Shapiro brothers in March of 1931, $10,000 each, around $250,000 in today's money and a small fortune in the midst of the Great Depression. The Brownsville boys didn't hesitate. After being ambushed and shot, they were already committed to killing the brothers. But one additional incident made the contract deeply personal. During another gambling-related dispute, Irving Shapiro sexually assaulted Abe Relis's girlfriend, Rosie Kirsch, of whom no photographs have survived. Whatever restraint had existed before was gone. And for Kid Twist, the war was now a vendetta. The bounty on the Shapiro brothers' heads brought new players into the fold. From nearby Ocean Hill came another crew, the Ocean Hill Hooligans, an Italian street outfit led by Harry Happy Maione and his close friend and protege, Frank the Dasher Abendando. Like the Brownsville boys, the Hooligans were a tight-knit gang of about 10 men, and just as lethal. Maione, whose face bore a permanent scowl, earned his nickname from the cruel irony of it. Abendando got his for a very different reason. He was known to sprint away from crime scenes hysterically laughing. They weren't brought in to reinforce the Brownsville boys, they came chasing the same prize. With bounties hanging over the Shapiros' heads, the two crews aligned and the hunt intensified. The first to fall was Irving Shapiro. In July 1931, he was beaten and then shot to death by Harry and Abe inside the Shapiro family home and headquarters at 691 Blake Avenue in Brooklyn, aged 27. Maya Shapiro survived a full 20 assassination attempts before Relis's crew targeted his brother, Irving. Finally, on September the 17th, 1931, acting on a tip-off, Relis, with the help of Harry and Bugsy, abducted Maya from a Manhattan speakeasy before executing him in a Lower East Side basement. Relis himself fired the fatal bullet. After two of the brothers were killed, the Shapiro's empire quickly crumbled, and the Brownsville boys were the new bosses in town. However, the final and most chilling act came 3 years later. On July the 20th, 1934, the last surviving brother, Willie Shapiro, was located after years on the run. At around 3 p.m, Willie was abducted as he left his safe house at 1845 Sterling Place in Ocean Hill by Pittsburgh Phil, Harry Maione and Frank Abendando, and taken to a safe house where he was brutally tortured. His skull, jaw and wrists were broken and his body was covered in bruises. Harry tied a cord around his throat, hands and feet and bound him in a sitting position so that any knee action or movement meant that he would have strangled himself to death. Then they put him in a burlap sack and took him to an abandoned sandpit in the marshes of Carnacy, about 100 feet from Fresh Creek Nature Preserve between Flatlands and Conklin Avenues, far from the eyes of the city where Harry, Relis and Bugsy buried him alive whilst he was still breathing. And with that, it's safe to say the Shapiro organisation was erased. For Lepke Buchalter, the message was impossible to ignore. The men responsible for wiping out the Shapiro brothers hadn't acted recklessly. They had worked methodically, patiently, and without mercy. They had taken on a powerful Brooklyn outfit and destroyed it completely. And most importantly, they had done exactly what Lepke needed done. This was the moment Lepke recognised the value of the Brownsville boys, not as street thugs, but as a disciplined extermination squad. And for Harry, it marked the beginning of a new phase of his life, killing not for territory, but for contract. The crew from Brownsville had proven something rare. They could eliminate an entire organisation without chaos, without hesitation, and without leaving unfinished business behind. What began as a street war had revealed something far more dangerous: a dedicated killing force. A tool that could serve the highest levels of organised crime. And that's exactly what Lepke and the criminal syndicate he represented were searching for. Professional killers on retainer who could be called upon any time to carry out mob hits on behalf of the families. That force would come to be known as Murder Incorporated, and Harry was set to become its most lethal weapon. By the early 1930s, the vast profits generated during Prohibition had catapulted the American Mafia into a level of influence and power that it had never seen before. In cities like New York, Chicago and Cleveland, the Italian Mafia controlled bootlegging, gambling, loan sharking, prostitution, labour unions, trucking and the docks. Running alongside them were powerful Jewish gangs, especially in New York, who dominated gambling, garment rackets and enforcement. Together, they formed what became known as the National Crime Syndicate, a loose but very real partnership between Italian and Jewish organised crime. The turning point came in 1931 after the bloody Castellamarese War. When the dust settled, Lucky Luciano emerged as the most forward-thinking mafia leader in New York City. He understood that endless turf wars were bad for business, and in response, he helped create the Commission, a kind of national board of directors for the Mafia and for the National Crime Syndicate. The commission included the bosses of New York's 5 mafia families, plus other heads of criminal factions like the aforementioned Lepke and key figures from other major cities. Its job was to settle disputes, divide territory and approve major hits, so that no one family could drag everyone into a war over personal grudges, which is exactly what started the Castellamarese War. But there was a problem. Even with the commission in place, decisions still had to be enforced. When the commission agreed that someone had to go, be it a rival boss, a suspected informant, a stubborn union leader or a troublesome politician, the bosses didn't want those murders traced back to their own soldiers. Using family hitmen created too many links, too many witnesses, and too much risk if anyone talked. They needed distance between the people giving the orders and the people doing the killing. And that's where Louis Lepke came in. Lepke now had something few bosses in New York possessed. A crew of young, fearless killers who had just proven themselves by wiping out the Shapiros. Word of their efficiency spread quickly. As the commission met and negotiated the future of organised crime, one thing became clear. If they wanted to prevent another all-out gang war, then they needed a reliable team, men who could quietly remove problems before they became conflicts. With Lepke and Lansky now vouching for them, that role fell to the Brownsville boys. But they weren't alone. The 2 hitters from Ocean Hill, Happy Mayone and Frank Abundando, had also caught the syndicate's attention. They fell under the wing of a man who controlled Brooklyn's docks and one of the most feared figures in New York City, Albert Anastasia, a man who was also known by another name, the Lord High Executioner. Anastasia ruled the waterfront unions and dockside rackets, enforcing his authority with open violence and absolute silence. Where Lepke ran labour like a business, Anastasia ruled like a warlord. Men disappeared, bodies surfaced in the river, no one talked. Among Italian mobsters, he was the man you called when someone needed to be removed permanently. Together, Lepke and Anastasia began shaping a new idea, a centralised killing crew that would work not for one family, but for them all. The structure followed the ethnic lines of the underworld, with Lepke overseeing the Jewish killers, many of them from Brownsville and the Lower East Side, and Anastasia overseeing the Italian hitmen, mostly from Brooklyn neighbourhoods like Ocean Hill and East New York. These guys didn't claim territory, they didn't run neighbourhoods. Their job was simpler and darker. Take contracts from the top and make people disappear. From this arrangement, the syndicate's enforcement arm was born. A mixed crew of Jewish and Italian killers who answered not to one boss or one family, but to the higher interests of organised crime itself. The Italian members of the group were to report to Anastasia and the Jewish mobsters to Lepke. On the streets, they would soon be known by a name that said it all: Murder Incorporated. To bolster the ranks of Murder Inc., other hitmen were added to their ranks from the Commission's networks. One of these was Whitey Krakow, real name Walter Krakower, who was already known as a dependable gunman who did his work without questions. He was also the brother of Esther Krakower, who was married to none other than Bugsy Siegel, Mafia hitman, childhood friend of both Lansky and Luciano, and one of the most feared men not just in New York City, but across the nation. Their ranks swelled further with hardened street killers like Charles the Bug Workman, nicknamed like Bugsy Goldstein for his jittery, unpredictable nature. Louis Pretty Amberg, better known for his cruelty than his looks, and Sholem Bernstein, a shifty-eyed killer and prolific car thief whose main task would be providing stolen getaway cars for the hits. Also joining them were Vito Chickenhead Garino, a volatile strong arm from East New York whose nickname was earned from his habit to shoot live chickens to practice his marksmanship. Walter Sage, a trusted gambling operative who doubled as a quiet but efficient executioner. Duke Maffatore, a seasoned Brownsville enforcer, and finally Irving Gangy Cohen, a streetwise gunman whose steady nerve made him valuable on high-risk assignments. Murder Inc. boasted around 40 members, and these men were the most notable. They were the muscle, the enforcers who would carry out the syndicate's darkest work. But among all of them, one man stood apart. Harry would become the linchpin of the group. He was a cold, efficient killer, but also an outright psychopath. He would later be linked to at least 100 murders, with some account placing the number around the 500 mark. And unlike most of the others, Strauss didn't kill just because he was ordered to. He actually enjoyed it. He reportedly took special pleasure in reading the newspapers the next morning after a hit and learning that his work had made the coroner vomit. His savage, emotionless methods soon became legendary, and before long, both Lepke and Anastasia would be assigning contracts to Harry personally, bypassing the Abe Relis and Murder Inc.'s usual chain of command. Once the crews linked up, the street gang mentality faded. To them, murder became simply work, something done with efficiency, speed, and a strange sense of pride. They were paid a regular salary of $3,000 a week as a retainer, equivalent to $72,000 in today's currency, with additional financial support provided to their families. They even needed an office, and they found it in a small Brownsville candy store called Midnight Roses, located at the corner of Saratoga and Livonia Avenue, right in the heart of the neighborhood where Abe, Bugsy, and Harry had grown up. Midnight Roses was run by a woman named Rosie Gold, of whom no photographs have survived, and from the outside it looked harmless, a place selling candy, cigarettes and newspapers, but behind the counter and near the payphone, it was something else entirely. Rosie herself ran numbers from the window, which was a kind of illegal lottery popular at the time, and she also operated a small brothel upstairs, serving as both a front and a facilitator. And this was where the orders came in. Lepke's and Anastasia's men would arrive to pass along assignments. Murder Inc. would sit around playing cards, drinking coffee, and waiting for the phone to ring. And when it rang, someone, somewhere, was about to die. Anastasia usually sent Louis Capone, no relation to Al. Louis was a loan shark from Coney Island who also ran a legitimate pasticceria, an Italian-style cafe serving coffee and pastry in Ocean Hill. The pasticceria became a popular hangout for Happy, the Dasher, and the rest of the hooligans, and Capone built a rapport with them when they were young by giving them free food. Before long, they were collecting debts on Louis's behalf, which is when they caught the eye of Anastasia, who frequented the pasticceria. But with Anastasia far too busy helping run the Mafia and sitting on the commission along with Lucky, Lansky and co., he sent Capone on his behalf, and it wasn't long before the contracts began coming in thick and fast. In October of 1932, Rocco Morgandy, of whom no photo survived, a racketeer in the Painters Union, became the target of a contract killing ordered by Capone. The exact motive was never confirmed, but some believed it was retaliation for a shooting in 1928. Others said that Morgandy's grip on a painters' labour's union had made him an obstacle, one that powerful figures wanted removed. Regardless of the reason, Capone assigned Harry and Rellis to do the job, and on October the 16th, Morgandy was lured to a friendly poker game in a small third-floor apartment. Outside, Capone waited in a parked car, watching the building entrance, while Harry and Rellis climbed the narrow staircase leading to the apartment. They burst into the apartment with revolvers already in hand and ordered the men to stand against the wall. A moment later, Harry and Rellis released a hail of bullets, striking Morgandy multiple times. Within seconds, they were gone, retreating down the stairwell and disappearing into the street, where Capone drove them away into the Brooklyn night. The hit was quick, coordinated and merciless, the first of many whilst operating as Murder Inc. In May 1933, another contract came down, this time from Joe Adonis, another powerful mobster who sat on the commission. The target was a small-time associate named John Frazier, of whom no photographs have survived, but we know that he'd been skimming profits from Adonis. The job was assigned to Happy Mayone, a native of Ocean Hill like Frazier, who also knew him personally. That detail made the hit colder by design because trust would be the weapon. On the night of May the 25th, Mayone, Chickenhead Garino and Harry rolled up in a dark Cadillac, the preferred tool of mob executioners because it was quiet, powerful and anonymous in city traffic. Frazier climbed into the car without hesitation, unaware that death now sat beside him. As the Cadillac moved through the dim Brooklyn streets, the inside of the car fell silent. No words were exchanged, the timing had already been decided. Then, without warning, the gunfire erupted. Harry and the others fired at point-blank range, the shots muffled by the thick upholstery. Frazier slumped forward, dead before the car had travelled another block. To Harry, it was just another clean execution, fast, contained, and without emotion. But even in death, Frazier caused one final problem. His hand locked reflexively around the leather door strap, grabbing it so tightly that it wouldn't release. The killers pulled to the curb and tried to pry his fingers open, but they wouldn't budge. They then pushed Frazier's body out into the street, still clutching the torn strap, as it ripped free from the door frame and landed behind him. The Cadillac pulled away into the night, leaving behind a body that no one would ever admit to seeing where it came from, and an upset Rellis because a dead man had gone to the afterlife, still holding a piece of his Cadillac. Later, in 1933, a reckless young thief named Red Alper crossed paths with Harry and sealed his own fate. At just 19 years old, Albert had managed to steal a bootload of valuable gems worth nearly $10,000, which is equivalent to nearly $250,000 in today's currency, a bold score for someone so young. but he had no way to move them safely on the street. Looking for a buyer with real underworld connections, Alper turned to Harry and offered him the stones for $3,000. Strauss countered with $700. It wasn't a serious negotiation, it was a declaration of control. Alper refused the offer sharply and without respect. The refusal didn't sit well. Harry returned to Alper with Relis and Bugsy, again demanding the diamonds for the same insultingly low price. Alper refused a second time, and this time was even more openly defiant. With Louis Capone's approval, Harry made the decision that followed almost automatically in their world. He cornered Alper on a yard in Van Seeklen Avenue and shot him 3 times in the head. At the time, the killing seemed like just another small, efficient execution in a city already numb to violence, but the murder of Alper would not disappear as so many others had. On February the 16th, 1934, a rare crack appeared inside the normally disciplined structure of the Brownsville crew when Relis became involved in a personal dispute with an African-American garage attendant named Charles Battles, of whom no photographs survived. A confrontation between the two men at the garage located at 110 East 98th Street quickly turned violent. Harry and Relis returned that afternoon and Alvin Snyder, another garage attendant, was stabbed by the duo who thought it was Battles. Snyder collapsed from his wounds and within hours, the underworld was buzzing with confusion and fear. This was not a clean execution. This was an error. Harry, Bugsy, Relis and Happy were arrested on April the 6th, 1934 and photographed with their weapons in what would become one of the most famous images of the era. They were charged with first-degree murder, and for once the machinery of Murder Inc. had drawn the full attention of law enforcement, and this time the case threatened to expose far more than a single killing. In the end, the charges did not fall evenly. Relis was convicted of the lesser charge of second-degree assault for the stabbing of Battles and sentenced to 3 years in prison. The murder charge against Harry, however, was dismissed for a lack of evidence, and once again, Pittsburgh Phil slipped away cleanly through the hands of the law and Murder Inc. had its main man back on the streets. That was crucial, because Murder Inc. was about to be deployed in full force. It started in September 1935 when Pretty Amberg, who had been an early member of the gang and had helped run the rackets in the garment industry for Lepke, recently broke free and attempted to carve out territory of his own with his brother, another member of Murder Inc., Joseph. Just like when the Shapiro brothers tried it 4 years ago, this didn't go down well with Lepke. At 12:45 p.m. on the 30th of September, Joseph Amberg and his chauffeur, Morris Kessler, of whom no photographs survive, were followed into their headquarters, a garage located on the corner of Blake and Christopher Avenue in Brownsville, by Harry, the Dasher Abundando, and Bluejaw Magoon. Amberg and Kessler were lined up against the wall and executed coldly, which reminded police at the time of the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre killing in Chicago 6 years earlier. Pretty Amberg had lost his brother and one of his main crew members, and he went into hiding, perhaps living a little longer than he expected once Pittsburgh Phil was sent for you. And that was because just 3 weeks later, Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz, an unpredictable and violently temperamental mob boss from the Bronx, would meet his end. He was under crushing legal pressure from Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, who was dismantling Dutch's empire piece by piece. Desperate, Schultz was hell-bent on killing Dewey, convinced it would make his problems disappear. When he brought the idea to the commission under Lucky Luciano, it was flatly rejected. A hit on a prosecutor of Dewey's stature would bring catastrophic heat on every single major crime family. Schultz vowed to proceed anyway, shouting that Dewey would be dead within 48 hours, and that defiance sealed his fate. Lepke assigned Charles the Bug Workman and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss to carry out the job. On October the 23rd, 1935, they entered the Palace Chop House at 12 East Park Street in Newark, New Jersey, where Schultz and his men were dining. Workman and Weiss opened fire, killing 3 of Schultz's top aides: Otto Abadabba Berman, his financial wizard; Abe Landau, his principal bodyguard; and Lulu Rosenkrantz, his driver and muscle. They then found Schultz in the men's room and shot him twice with a revolver. Schultz clung to life for nearly 24 hours, finally dying the next day. The Palace Chop House hit would become one of the most infamous executions in organised crime history. But Murder Inc. wasn't done there, because the very next day after Dutch Schultz was killed, Pretty Amberg met the same fate as his brother. On the morning of October the 23rd, 1935, Pretty Amberg's body was discovered in the back seat of a burning car across from 131 North Elliott Place in Brooklyn. He'd been stripped of his clothing, his hands bound with wire, a sack placed over his head, and 3 bullets fired into his skull, delivered by Happy Mayone and Harry. A witness who first noticed the fire reported seeing several men fleeing the scene. And for the brutal trail of death that Murder Inc. would leave, this was just the beginning, because another young man was already drifting towards his own collision with Pittsburgh Phil. Sol Jack Goldstein, of whom no photographs exist, was only 24 years old, but he was already deeply embedded in the rackets of Fulton Fish Market, a criminal gold mine that fed millions of dollars into New York's underworld. And his private life was just as volatile. He became involved with Evelyn Mittelman, a woman whose relationships with gangsters had a habit of ending in blood. After Goldstein killed one of her former boyfriends in 1935, he and Evelyn grew close until Harry noticed her. What followed was swift and humiliating. A confrontation in a Brooklyn pool hall ended with Goldstein laid out by a pool cue, and soon after, Harry took Evelyn for himself. On the street, she would become known as the Kiss of Death Girl due to a habit of her boyfriends being murdered. By the summer of 1936, Goldstein's troubles moved beyond jealousy and grudges. A major investigation into racketeering at the Fulton Fish Market now threatened the empire of Joseph Sox Lanza, the Genovese power who controlled the union and its massive extortion profits. Goldstein, rattled and talking openly about getting out of the life, suddenly became a liability. He knew too much. Lanza made the decision, Louis Capone delivered the orders, and Harry volunteered for the job. At the time that the contract was issued, Goldstein had just remarried and had gone into the mountains around Glen Wild Lake in New Jersey on his honeymoon, unaware that his life had already been signed away. On the morning of August the 3rd, 1936, Anthony Duke Maffatore and Abe Pretty Levine, a new young recruit to Murder Inc., lured Goldstein from his cabin under false pretenses. Once inside their car, he was seized and knocked unconscious with a hammer. Following Harry's instructions, they kept him alive just long enough to deliver him. Harry bound him with a clothesline rigged to tighten with movement, wrapped his body in a blanket, and took him out to the lake. There, without ceremony, Goldstein was thrown overboard alive. His body was never recovered. His new bride never reported him missing, and for Harry, the contract was fulfilled. But the satisfaction was deeply personal. The next hit was on a target who was also suspected of talking to the authorities. By 1936, Irving Ashkenas, a Lithuanian-American cab driver and seasoned ex-con, had been granted parole and was back to the streets. But this time, whispers began to spread that Ashkenas was talking to the law, quietly feeding information to Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey about Lepke's grip on Manhattan's labor unions. When Lepke learned that Ashkenas was suspecting of cooperating with Dewey, the order was immediate. The execution was assigned to Harry, TikTok Tannenbaum and Gangi Cohen. On a September night in 1936, they found Ash Kenner seated behind the wheel of his cab outside the Paramount Manor Hotel of Happiness located near Hurleyville in upstate New York. To anyone watching, it looked like a routine fare pickup. To the hit team, it was a perfectly staged trap. Seconds later, the quiet street exploded with gunfire. Ash Kennis was struck repeatedly and slumped sideways behind the wheel. Detectives at first believed the killer had posed as a passenger. 4 shots appeared to have come from outside the cab and 1 from the passenger side. But the autopsy told a far darker story. 16 wounds were found on the body, including deep stab injuries, a brutal signature often associated with Harry. 5 bullets from 2 different guns confirmed what the street already knew. This was a coordinated execution. To the public, it was another unsolved gangland killing. To the underworld, the message was unmistakable. Informants did not simply die, they were erased. And once again, Harry walked away from the scene as he always did, unseen, uncharged, and untouched by consequence. But Ash Kennis's death was not an isolated warning, it was part of a widening purge. By 1936, the greatest threat to Lepke's empire no longer came from rival gangs, but from men who might talk. Now his main target, Dutch Schultz, was dead. Special prosecutor Thomas Dewey was closing in on the syndicate through the labor unions, and every whisper of cooperation was treated as a death sentence. The underworld was gripped by paranoia. Old associates became liabilities overnight. One such liability was Joseph Rosen. Rosen had once owned a small trucking business in Brownsville until Lepke's labour racketeering crushed it and forced him out. Now stripped of his livelihood, he scraped by running a modest candy store located at 725 Sutter Avenue in Brooklyn. By the summer of 1936, Lepke became convinced, rightly or not, that Rosen was preparing to cooperate with Dewey. That suspicion alone was enough. The contract was issued through Mendy Weiss, with Harry assigned as backup. On the morning of September the 13th, 1936, the team went into position. Scholl and Bernstein waited behind the wheel of the getaway car whilst Abe Rellis took his place at the door as a lookout. When Rosen entered his shop, Mendy Weiss went in first, with Harry close behind. Inside the candy store, the execution was swift and merciless. Weiss fired 6 shots into Rosen's chest, killing him instantly. Then Harry stepped forward and, either out of impulse or indulgence, fired 4 more rounds into the lifeless body. They then fled cleanly. When Mendy Weiss later reported Harry's excess to Lepke, the boss showed no concern. Rosen was dead. The message had been delivered, and once again, Harry had added his signature to another silenced informant, and now he was about to add it to an old associate. George Whitey Rudnick had been with Rellis's original Brownsville Boys crew since the late 1920s. He was a loan shark, a hanger-on, and a hopeless drug addict, unstable, unreliable, and increasingly dangerous. By the spring of 1937, Harry became convinced that Rudnick had started talking to a detective. In their world, rumours alone were enough to earn a death sentence. Harry made it clear to the others, a junkie with loose lips could sink them all, and the decision came quickly and without debate. Rudnick had to disappear. For 4 days, they hunted him through Brooklyn streets, watching and waiting until they finally spotted him shuffling along a sidewalk, thin, dazed, and half lost in addiction. Abendando pulled up beside him and offered him a ride. Rudnick climbed in without hesitation, unaware that he had just stepped into his own execution. Abendando drove him to a garage at 2310 Atlantic Avenue, which is still a garage today, where Harry and Happy Mayone were waiting. Inside, the mood turned instantly predatory. Abendando grabbed Rudnick from behind, pinning his arms, while Harry slipped a clothesline over his head and pulled it tight until the life drained out of him. But even that wasn't enough. Stab wounds later found in Rudnick's chest showed that his heart, lungs and liver had been slashed in a savage frenzy. When they tried to load the body into the car, they realised that he was too tall, so Abendando bent the legs to force him inside, and the pressure pushed a burst of air from the lungs, creating a faint, choking sound. In a flash of panic and rage, Harry believed Rudnick was still alive and began stabbing again and again and again, 63 times in all. Then, in a final grotesque gesture, Mayone lifted a meat cleaver and muttered, "Let me hit this bastard once for luck," before bringing it down hard and splitting Rudnick's skull in two. It was another message written in blood, not just for enemies on the outside, but for anyone on the inside who forgot what true loyalty meant. They dumped his body in the back of Abendando's car outside 1190 Jefferson Avenue in Bushwick, a mile away from the garage on Atlantic Avenue, but they had no time to enjoy the killing, because just a few days later they again had to murder one of their own. And that man was Walter Sage. He'd been part of the Brownsville boys from the very beginning, a close friend of Harry and the trusted man who oversaw their slot machine operations in the Catskills. For a time, the two had even lived together in Brooklyn. Sage's right-hand man was Gangy Cohen, a steady presence who handled the books and enforced Sage's authority. But by the summer of 1937, the numbers stopped adding up. The gang's own tallies didn't match Sage's records, money was missing, excuses followed, and in that world, missing money meant only one thing. Harry decided Sage was stealing, and once Harry made a decision like that, there was no appeal. The execution was planned with the same careful precision Harry brought to every contract. Around July the 20th, Harry summoned Pretty Levine, who was vacationing nearby, and told him to pick him up at the Evans Hotel in Loch Sheldrake, located at 712 Hurleyville Road. The two men waited in Levine's car along a dark rural road until another vehicle approached and blinked its headlights, the signal. Inside was Sage, Cohen and another young recruit from Brownsville, Jack Drucker. Sage sat amongst men he trusted, unaware that every face around him had already signed his death warrant. The car moved along the empty stretch of road. Harry made his move. He slipped an arm around Sage's neck and drove an ice pick into him again and again, more than 30 times in total. When it was over, blood filled the back seat, but Sage was still alive. Hearing Sage still whimpering, Harry used his signature final blow and tied a cord around Sage's feet and neck, meaning he too would have strangled himself to death. The killing shattered Gangy Cohen. Convinced he'd be next, he ran into the woods and vanished into the night, eventually fleeing to California where he went into hiding. Harry and Jack Drucker transferred Sage's body into Levine's car and drove the 15-minute journey to Swan Lake in Liberty, Sullivan County, located along New York State Route 55. There they tied a pinball machine around the corpse and lashed heavy metal framing to it, trying to ensure that it would never surface. The body was dumped into the black water and left to disappear. But 10 days later, campers found it floating near the shore. The makeshift weights had failed and trapped gases had lifted the corpse back to the surface. When word reached Harry, he didn't panic. He only smirked and muttered, "With this bum, you gotta be a doctor, or he floats." It was the kind of joke only a man completely desensitized to death could make. A reminder that for Harry, killing had long since become routine. By late 1937, Pittsburgh Phil was known throughout the underworld as a precise and relentless contract killer. But on November the 8th, death followed him outside the rules of syndicate violence. Driving through Brooklyn at Kings Highway and East 96th Street, Harry struck and killed 71-year-old Clara Nittleman as she crossed the street. There was no contract, no underworld motive, just a civilian life ended in an instant. For one of the first confirmed times in his long list of killings, a woman had become one of Harry's victims. The following day, Harry was booked on a homicide charge at the Empire Boulevard police station located at 421 Empire Boulevard in Brooklyn, now the 71st Precinct. He calmly gave his occupation as a garage proprietor living at 558 Sackman Street, masking a reputation the newspapers quickly exposed. To police and reporters alike, he was already a known racketeer with a long arrest record, a man repeatedly taken into custody but never convicted. Even in an accidental killing, the pattern remained the same. Death surrounded Harry, and once again, he seemed poised to slip through the cracks. But while one life ended on a Brooklyn street, another reckoning was already being arranged hundreds of miles away. That reckoning centered on Harry Millman, a violent fixture of Detroit's Purple Gang who had long been a thorn in the side of the Italian Mafia. By late 1937, tensions finally exploded. Fueled by Millman's growing interference in Mafia rackets and an alleged barroom beating of Scarface Joe Bomarito, a made man in the Detroit Mafia whose humiliation could not go unanswered. In Mafia tradition, a made man was a formally initiated member, someone who had sworn lifelong loyalty during a secret ceremony in which blood was drawn, a holy card burned in his palm, and an oath taken that bound him to the family forever. Such initiation conferred protection and status. Assaulting a made man without permission was viewed as an attack on the entire organisation, a grave insult that demanded blood. Millman had crossed a line the syndicate never ignored. The first attempt on Millman's life came in August 1937 at around 3 a.m. as he stepped out of the upscale 1040 Club located at 1040 Wayne Street in Detroit after an evening of dining and dancing. While Millman lingered outside waiting for his men, the club's valet, Willie Holmes, slid behind the wheel of Millman's Cadillac to start the engine. The moment Holmes turned the ignition, 7 to 10 sticks of dynamite wired to the spark plug detonated. The explosion ripped through the quiet street, shattering windows in surrounding buildings, setting off burglar alarms, and launching the Cadillac's hood onto the roof of a 5-story structure. Holmes was mortally wounded and died later that day. Millman, by sheer luck, emerged from the attempt completely unharmed, a narrow escape that only delayed the reckoning already closing in on him. The botched explosion only hardened the syndicate's resolve. After that failure, Mayone and Harry were dispatched to Detroit to finish the job properly. Millman's reckoning finally arrived on the night of November the 25th, 1937, at Boski's Restaurant and Delicatessen at 8900 12th Street and Hazelwood Avenue on Detroit's near west side. Shortly before 1 a.m, Millman approached the bar to order more drinks. Harry and Mayone, dressed in dark snap-brim hats and tan polo coats, entered from the Delicatessen. Without hesitation, they approached Millman and opened fire with automatic pistols from point-blank range. Millman was killed instantly, collapsing to the floor before he could react. As patrons dove for cover, the gunmen continued firing, wounding several others, including Millman's bodyguard Harry Gross and 2 innocent bystanders who were struck by stray bullets. Gross would die 2 weeks later. It was a public execution meant to be seen. The murder of Harry Millman showed just how far Murder Inc.'s reach now extended, and what happened to anyone who interfered with Mafia-controlled territory, no matter what city they ran in. By the summer of 1938, Harry had become more than just a weapon aimed at outsiders. He was now being used to clean house inside the syndicate itself. While vacationing in the Catskills that August, Harry received direct contact from Lepke. These mountains were more than a resort getaway for Jewish gangsters. They were a safe zone, a place where bookmakers, union racketeers and hitmen mingled freely among vacationing families. Cabarets and bungalow colonies served dual roles, summer nightlife for tourists and discreet meeting spots for the underworld. The target this time was Hyman Yoren, a high-ranking member of Lepke's own organisation whose usefulness had run its course. Yoren had been assigned to supervise rackets in the Catskills, but he'd begun drinking heavily, flashing money and talking too freely. In Lepke's world, that combination was deadly. On August the 21st, 1938, Yoren had been vacationing at the Flagler Hotel, a prominent resort on Hotel Row along Route 42 in Fallsburg, Sullivan County. Yoren took a phone call, walked down to the front of the hotel, and got into his own automobile driven by a mysterious blonde woman. He was never seen alive again. He would later be killed by Harry, who shot him 3 times in the head. After the hit, Harry, TikTok, Jack Drucker and Sholem Bernstein transported Yoren's body to the Browns Hotel construction site on Hurleyville Road, where a swimming pool was under excavation. There they buried him in a fresh pit near the foundation, concealing the murder beneath an ordinary construction project. The killing of Yoren sent another chilling message through the underworld. Not even Lepke's inner circle was safe, and Harry was now the man trusted to carry out executions at the very highest levels of the syndicate. By 1939, as Thomas Dewey's investigation tightened its grip on the syndicate, even long-time insiders became liabilities. Whitey Friedman, a collector for Lepke, was arrested and released on bail, and in the paranoid world of organised crime, that alone was enough to sign his death warrant. Lepke became convinced that Friedman might talk, and once again, when silence had to be guaranteed, he turned to Pittsburgh Phil. As usual, the murder was planned with cold precision. Louis Capone supplied a shotgun and a pistol, both sawed off by Abe Relis and handed to Harry. Sawing off the barrels made the weapons far easier to conceal under coats, quicker to draw in tight spaces, and harder for a victim to grab or deflect at close range. The shortened barrels also widened the spread of the shot, ensuring maximum damage in a sudden street attack. Harry chose Bluejaw Magoon to assist him. For days, they tracked Friedman through Manhattan and the subway, learning his routine. On the day of the hit, Harry and Bluejaw followed him into Brooklyn. As Friedman walked down the street near his home at 22 East 96th Street in Brooklyn, Harry leaned out of the car, raised the sawed-off shotgun and fired a single, devastating blast that killed him instantly. The escape was as methodical as the kill. Harry and his crew drove to Lincoln Terrace Park on East New York Avenue in Brooklyn and discarded the shotgun. Bluejaw hid the pistol beneath a rock in a vacant lot and retrieved it the following morning under the cover of a late-night outing. Another problem solved. It was the same familiar pattern, precise, ruthless, and engineered to leave as little behind as possible. And once again, Harry stood at the centre of it. But the machinery of violence never paused, and by September 1939, a new target had already been selected. That target was Irving Puggy Feinstein, a former boxer turned betting operator in Borough Park who operated from his headquarters at 4602 13th Avenue. His operations sat squarely on territory claimed by Vincent Mangano, which stretched from Red Hook to Bensonhurst. Vincent Mangano, also known as Vincent the Executioner, was Albert Anastasia's boss and one of the bosses of the 5 New York Mafia families. Mangano viewed Feinstein as not just competition, but as an intrusion that could not be tolerated. The order moved quickly down the chain. Mangano contacted Albert Anastasia, and Anastasia passed the contract down without hesitation to the man he trusted most with delicate work, Pittsburgh Phil. For weeks, Harry and the crew searched the boroughs, unable to locate their target. The break came on September the 5th on a street corner in Brownsville. Harry was standing with Relis and Bugsy when a small, pug-nosed man approached them. Asking if they knew a local loan shark, Harry recognised him instantly. It was Puggy. Without alarm, they improvised. Bugsy offered to help him look for the man and drove him through the neighbourhood while Harry and Relis prepared the trap. Eventually, Bugsy steered Puggy into Rellis's house at 649 East 91st Street. The moment Puggy stepped inside, Harry struck. A violent struggle erupted. Puggy bit down on Harry's finger, sending him into a rage. The crew tied him up and, with methodical brutality, strangled him with a clothesline. The body was dumped at a nearby refuse site in Cypress Hills and set on fire in an attempt to erase the evidence. The flames were seen, the fire was reported, but once again Harry walked away from the scene as he always had, with evidence destroyed and confidence high. However, by the end of 1939, that confidence was about to meet its reckoning. For years, Harry Rellis and Murder Inc. had operated with near total impunity across Brooklyn and beyond, leaving bodies in alleys, dumps, basements and lakes, while police ran into the same walls over and over again. Fear, silence and missing witnesses. But the tide was finally beginning to turn. Less than 4 months after the murder of Puggy, a new Brooklyn District Attorney, John J. Bennett Jr., took office. A methodical prosecutor with no appetite for underworld compromise, Bennett immediately set his sights on the syndicate of killers that had mocked the justice system for nearly a decade. Bennett understood that Murder Inc. could not be broken from the outside, it would have to be cracked from within. To do that, he turned to a young, relentless assistant district attorney named Burton Turkus, assigning him to untangle more than 200 unsolved murders tied to the gang. The strategy was simple and dangerous: relentless pressure, plea deals for cooperators, and absolute protection for anyone willing to talk. It was the first time the system openly challenged the gang on its own terms. The investigation exploded into motion on January 2nd, 1940, when Rellis, Sol Goldstein and Duke Maffetore were arrested for the murder of Red Alper, based largely on information supplied by a troubled petty criminal of whom no photos survive, named Harry Rudolph, who had been sitting in jail as a material witness. Rudolph had quietly passed a note to prosecutors claiming that he had knowledge of the Alper killing and other Brownsville murders, a gesture that, despite his reputation for instability, was enough to jolt investigators into action. His lead opened the first crack in the Brownsville wall of silence, giving the district attorney grounds to begin hauling in suspects. 2 weeks later, the net tightened further when Harry, Mayone and Abundando were taken into custody as well. Rudolph's note turned out to be the loose thread that unravelled the most feared killing machine in America. After the arrest of Rellis, Goldstein and Maffetore, prosecutors began pressing each man relentlessly. The first to crack was Maffetore, who realised that the DA's office finally had enough leverage and enough names to make life very difficult for anyone who wanted to stay loyal. Faced with the possibility of the electric chair and with no help coming from above, Maffetore began offering details about the Alper killing and hinting at the wider web of contract murders carried out at the behest of Lepke Buchalter's organisation. His cooperation was cautious at first, but it was exactly the signal that investigators needed. With Maffetore talking, attention shifted immediately to Rellis. Detectives and prosecutors recognised instantly that if Rellis could be flipped, the entire structure of Murder Inc., the killers, the contracts, the chain of command, it could all fall in a matter of months. Rellis resisted hard at the start, but as the evidence mounted and isolation set in, he made the fateful decision that would reshape organised crime history. Abe Rellis agreed to cooperate. Once he began talking, he did not hold back. Burton Turkus later said that Rellis enjoyed bragging about the murders. He systematically laid out names, dates, motives, methods, and the internal hierarchy of the killing squad, tying street murders directly to Lepke's labour racket empire. Acting on information from Rellis, detectives found 7 bodies of victims of Murder Inc., including the remains of Hyman Yoren, who had been killed by Harry and Locke Sheldrake the year before. From there, the dominoes fell quickly. Relis's testimony implicated Louis Capone, Harry, the Dasher Abendando, Bugsy Goldstein, Happy Maione, Louis Lepke himself, and countless lesser enforcers, providing prosecutors with the clearest roadmap they had ever possessed of the syndicate's inner workings. For the first time, high-ranking racketeers like Lepke faced capital charges based on the testimony of their own hitmen. As Relis talked, panic spread through the remaining ranks. While Harry awaited trial behind prison walls, another detail emerged that strengthened the case tightening around him. A woman claiming to be his sister, Eva, made repeated visits to the jail. The authorities grew suspicious. During one visit, her deception was exposed. She was not his sister at all, but she was Evelyn, the infamous Kiss of Death girl. She arrived wearing 3 diamond rings, which she claimed Harry had given her, and that detail struck hard. It matched Relis's earlier testimony about the robbery of Red Alper, the young jewel thief whose stolen diamonds had been taken by the Brownsville crew before he was murdered. Now those same stones, or what appeared to be them, were glittering on Evelyn's fingers. The walls were closing in on Harry from every direction. Realizing her value, prosecutors set Evelyn's bail at $50,000, holding her as a potential witness despite her protests. She knew too much, not only about Harry, but about the money, the murders, and the men still clinging to freedom. From inside custody, she spoke openly about the wave of betrayals ripping through the gang, remarking that Kid Twist had done the smart thing by talking first and hinting that Harry should do the same. And Harry, the man who had once laughed at death, now wavered. Word spread that he was willing to cooperate too, but only if it guaranteed his own survival. Loyalty was gone, fear had replaced it, and one by one the killers of Murder Inc. began turning on each other, feeding the legal machine with confessions, names and bodies. The group that had once ruled through silence was now being destroyed by voices of its strongest soldiers, each one scrambling to save their own skin. What began as a cryptic note from a small-time hoodlum in a jail cell had become the catalyst for the total collapse of Murder Inc. The first trial to emerge from Relis's revelations involved Maione and Abendando. Charged with the 1937 brutal murder of Whitey Rudnick in Brooklyn, Harry was also indicted in connection with the killing. In the courtroom, District Attorney William O'Dwyer spoke with cold certainty as he laid out the case before the grand jury and the press. He described Harry as the most vicious killer in the Brooklyn Syndicate, a career assassin who carried out most of the slayings, sometimes just to deliver the final blow. O'Dwyer made it clear that in the final years of Murder Inc., Harry and Maione had become even more ruthless than Relis, the former leader whose betrayal now fueled the prosecutions. With pressure mounting and testimony closing in from every direction, Harry made the fateful decision to cooperate with the district attorney's office. The move triggered a quiet but decisive shift in the courtroom. The judge granted a severance, formally removing Harry from the group indictment so the jury would never see him flip. Court officers escorted him out a side door, not back to the holding cells, but into the custody of the DA's own protective detail, where he was kept isolated from the other defendants. His case was placed on administrative pause, the charges still hanging over him while prosecutors evaluated what he could offer. But the maneuver brought him no real escape. His crimes were too many, too brutal, and too well documented. Even out of the courtroom, the inevitable sentence still awaited him. Even as he spoke, the shadow of the electric chair continued to loom. As Harry awaited trial in Brooklyn City Prison, he began faking signs of insanity, hoping to manipulate the court in a final act to try and escape his inevitable fate. Guards and fellow inmates reported that he would pace relentlessly in his cell, muttering to himself in fragmented, almost nonsensical phrases, occasionally laughing or cursing under his breath for no apparent reason. At times he would stare blankly at the walls for hours, rocking slightly or scribbling incoherent lines on scraps of paper, giving the impression of a man unravelling at the edges. By September 1940, even his appearance became part of the legal battle. Harry had grown a heavy, unkempt beard which back then was considered to be a sign of insanity. Prosecutors argued it was another calculated move, a disguise meant to confuse witnesses and soften his image before the jury. Kings County Judge Franklin Taylor ordered that Harry was to be shaved before trial, siding with District Attorney William O'Dwyer, who insisted the beard was a calculated tool in his scheme. Harry's defense protested, arguing that the order violated his client's constitutional rights. The jail barber, under the uneasy watch of guards who feared bringing a razor near the notorious killer, shaved him using clippers only. Despite the removal of the beard, Harry continued his performance, speaking in odd tones, mumbling half-formed threats, and occasionally bursting into strange fits of laughter or sudden silence, all carefully calibrated to project instability. Even though court-appointed psychiatrists had already declared him sane, Harry's act underscored his desperation and cunning, a last theatrical attempt to influence the outcome of the trial that would determine his fate. The trial of Harry and Bugsy for the murder of Puggy Feinstein opened in September 1940. And from the very first day, Harry leaned hard into the role that he'd prepared for weeks. In the courtroom, he muttered to himself, rolled his eyes, and drifted in and out of strange staring spells. At times, he paced in small circles beside the defense table. At others, he sat rigid, gazing at the wall as if the trial were happening somewhere far away. The prosecution insisted there was nothing wrong with him, that every twitch, every mumble was a calculated performance meant to confuse the jury and escape responsibility. Bugsy, watching a longtime partner testify against him, seemed stunned by the weight of what was unfolding. Harry, meanwhile, barely acknowledged the drama around him, lost in his own carefully staged unreality. Then Relis took the stand. In cool, direct language, he described how the murder had been ordered after Feinstein crossed interests tied to Vincent Mangano, with approval flowing down through Anastasia. Relis told the jury how he, Bugsy and Harry had carried out the killing. His account was reinforced by Blue Jaw Magoon, another Murder Inc. member who had also flipped. Harry's lawyer clung to the claim of insanity. When Harry was finally called to the stand, the performance reached its peak. He refused to take the oath. He muttered nonsense under his breath, rolled his eyes wildly, and at one point even chewed on the leather strap of a briefcase as if detached from the world around him. But the courtroom did not waver because the judges, jurors and spectators all saw what it was. Not madness, but theatre. A final desperate attempt by a seasoned killer to delay the verdict that was now bearing down on him. On September the 19th, 1940, after weeks of testimony that laid bare the hidden machinery of organised murder in New York City, the reckoning finally arrived. The trial had gripped the city from the moment it opened. Day after day of immense detail, confessions from former killers, maps of executions and cold descriptions of bodies dumped in garages, lakes and vacant lots. Newspapers packed their front pages with every revelation. Courtroom seats filled before dawn. The public listened in stunned silence as the true scale of Murder Inc.'s work was exposed piece by piece. By the time the case went to the jury, there was little left in doubt. The jurors withdrew, and after just 1 hour and 25 minutes, they returned. The verdict was swift and absolute. Harry and Bugsy were found guilty of first-degree murder, and the sentence followed without pause or ambiguity: death by electric chair. For a city that had lived under the quiet terror of contract killing for nearly a decade, the verdict landed not only with shock, but with a grim sense of finality. The men who had once seemed untouchable were, at last, no longer beyond the reach of the law. As the sentence was read, the illusion finally shattered. Harry was led from the courtroom shuffling, mumbling softly, stripped of the iron confidence that had once defined him. Bugsy broke instead, tears forming as he cried out, "Don't I deserve a chance to say one little word before I die?" Only a few years earlier, that same man had boasted at a police lineup that he deserved a higher ranking than public enemy number 6, vowing he would work harder to climb the ladder of crime. Now the ladder ended here. Before they were taken away, Judge John J. Fitzgerald addressed the jury directly, revealing that prosecutors had evidence tying Harry to 28 murders since 1930. He wanted them to understand the weight of what they'd done and the necessity of it. As the condemned men were escorted out of Brooklyn's Supreme Court, Harry paused only long enough to turn towards his mother and 2 sisters, offering a faint, almost apologetic smile, the first trace of softness anyone had seen from him in weeks. It was a fragile, fleeting moment of humanity, swallowed almost instantly by the machinery of the state. From the courthouse steps, deputies loaded the prisoners into a police sedan and drove them across the East River to Grand Central Terminal at 89 East 42nd Street, and there, under heavy guard, the men were moved onto a reserved car at the rear of the northbound train, shackled hand and foot between state troopers. The train carried them up the Hudson Line to Ossining Station, where additional officers waited on the platform. From the station, the prisoners were marched up the short incline to Sing Sing Prison, processed through the admissions gate, and escorted down the narrow corridor to the death house. Within minutes, they were placed in the row of cells only steps from the execution chamber, the final destination on a journey that had begun in the courtroom hours earlier and would end in the electric chair. In his final days at Sing Sing, Harry abandoned the insanity act that had once been his last shield. He allowed himself a clean shave, a final quiet assertion of control after a life spent taking it from others. Evelyn Mittelman, the woman who had witnessed so much blood and killing at his side, was granted one last visit. They spoke softly through the bars. What was said was never recorded. What followed could not be stopped. On June the 12th, 1941, the life Harry had built on fear and death was about to end, as the law finally closed its grip on him, delivering justice he could no longer escape. At 11 a.m, his longtime partner in crime, Bugsy, was led to the chamber first. They had spent their lives running the streets together, but in their final moments, each walked alone to the same fate that awaited them. 3 minutes later, Bugsy Goldstein was pronounced dead. At 11:06 a.m, guards returned for Harry. This time there was no performance to hide behind, no muttering, no wild eyes. He rose quietly and walked with a steady, measured pace, the same calm precision with which he had once entered garages and back rooms where others met their end, and now it was his turn. Witnesses later said that as Harry was seated in the chair, he looked out across the room not with panic, but with a strange, unreadable acceptance. His eyes drifted slowly from face to face, as if taking inventory one final time, marking the last witnesses to his life. The leather straps were tightened around his wrists and chest, the metal cap was secured against his shaved scalp. A heavy silence settled over the chamber, and at 11:09 a.m, the switch was thrown. The current surged through his body, arching him hard against the restraints. The electricity held, then released, leaving the air thick with a biting metallic smell and a sense of finality. A second charge followed, absolute, unforgiving, when the physician stepped forward and pronounced him dead. The story of Harry Strauss, the immigrant boy, the street dandy, the most feared killer in Murder Inc., reached its final line. Harry was laid to rest at Beth David Cemetery, the Jewish burial ground at 300 Elmont Road in Elmont, New York, where his family gathered quietly after the execution to complete the final rites. The convictions and executions of Harry and Bugsy marked the first decisive breakthrough for District Attorney William O'Dwyer and Assistant District Attorney Burton Turkus against a machine that had operated in darkness for nearly a decade. Murder Inc. had been a ghost army, nameless killers, disappearing bodies, witnesses too terrified to speak. Now, two of its most feared executioners had been dragged into the light of a public courtroom and sentenced to die, shattering the myth of their invincibility. But even in victory, O'Dwyer and Turkus knew that this was only the beginning. The architects of the bloodshed still walked free. Above them all loomed one figure, the man they believed gave the orders with a quiet nod and an invisible hand, Albert Anastasia, or as he was more commonly known, the Lord High Executioner. His name alone kept longshoremen obedient and rival gangsters cautious. Bringing him down would strike at the very core of organised crime itself. Relis had given them a path forward. According to his testimony, Anastasia had personally ordered multiple murders, including the killing of Pete Panto, the young dock union reformer who dared to challenge corruption on the Brooklyn waterfront. Panto had tried to organise the longshoremen against extortion and violence, but Anastasia had answered in the only language that he ever used. For years, Panto was simply missing. And then, in January 1941, the truth surfaced from a lime pit in Lyndhurst, New Jersey. His skeletal remains sealed in concrete like industrial waste. Murder Inc. had silenced him. The case against Anastasia was no longer rumour, it was forming into fact. All that remained was for Relis to testify. For months, Relis was kept under what officials called maximum protection. He was detained on the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel on Coney Island, guarded around the clock by a hand-picked police detail. Confident and boastful, Relis told anyone who would listen that he was ready to sing until the walls shook. According to prosecutors, Anastasia's fate finally seemed within reach. Then, just before dawn on November the 12th, 1941, everything collapsed. Relis was found dead on the roof of a second-floor extension beneath his hotel window. His body lay twisted in the darkness. Above him, the window gaped open. Authorities immediately declared it an escape attempt gone wrong. 2 bedsheets tied together, fastened to a thin wire hooked to a radiator. They claimed Relis had tried to climb down, lost his grip, and fell. But nothing about the scene made sense. The wire was barely secured, the knots were clumsy and mismatched, and the room had been guarded by 6 officers, none of whom claimed to have seen or heard a thing. Suspicion spread instantly through the city like wildfire. Was it suicide, a desperate escape, or a quiet syndicate execution carried out under the eyes of the law itself? The newspapers coined the phrase that would follow the case forever: the canary who could sing but couldn't fly. For the prosecutors, it was a devastating blow. They had torn open the heart of Murder Inc., carted its most vicious killers to the electric chair, and yet the one man they believed controlled it all had slipped from their grasp once again. The war against the syndicate was far from finished, but the death of Relis proved one chilling truth beyond doubt. even under police protection, even inside a guarded hotel, even with the full weight of the law closing in, the enemy was still powerful enough to silence a witness forever. The following day, the fallout came swiftly. All 6 police officers assigned to guard Rellis were quietly demoted. Their explanation that they'd been sitting in the adjoining room and somehow heard nothing was met with open disbelief. To the public, it sounded less like negligence than a carefully rehearsed excuse. Across Brooklyn, the rumours spread immediately. People whispered that Rellis had not fallen at all, that he'd been pushed. The scene, they said, looked too staged, too convenient to be the result of a sudden escape attempt. And there was one detail that no official explanation could overcome. Rellis had never wanted to flee. He'd repeatedly told both the police and prosecutors that he was safer under state protection than he ever could be on the street. The idea that he would suddenly risk his life climbing out of a hotel window made no sense to anyone who truly understood his terror of the Mafia. Then came the darker rumours, because word circulated that a member of the commission, Frank Costello, had raised as much as $100,000, $2.4 million in today's currency, to ensure that Rellis would never reach the witness stand. At the time, it was dismissed as street talk, but decades later, the whispers gained new weight. Because in 2005, it was revealed that NYPD detective Charles Burns, one of the very men guarding Rellis that night, had long been suspected in another of New York's greatest unsolved mysteries, the disappearance of anti-corruption judge Joseph Force Crater in 1930. The implication was clear. If the suspicions were true, then the most valuable witness in the history of the Mafia had not slipped from a window in a panic. He'd been removed, quietly, efficiently, and with the kind of reach that only the highest levels of organised crime could command. And in the vacuum left by Rellis' silenced testimony, justice moved forward unevenly, sometimes stalled by corruption, sometimes driven by sheer momentum. 2 men the prosecutors could still reach was the leaders of the Ocean Hill hooligans, Frank Abendando and Happy Maione. Their road to the electric chair was anything but straightforward. They were first convicted of the first-degree murder of Whitey Rudnick in May 1940, only to see the verdict overturned on appeal. For a time, it appeared that they might escape the fate that had claimed their partners Bugsy and Harry, but the second trial left no room for doubt. Once again, they were found guilty, this time without reprieve. On February the 19th, 1942, Happy and the Dasher were executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing, another pillar of Murder Inc. extinguished. But the executions did not end there. Louis Lepke's trial began in November 1941 in a crowded Brooklyn courtroom. Prosecutors Turkus and O'Dwyer built their case carefully, combining Rellis' statements with testimony from Max Rubin, a former trusted associate who had once overheard Lepke discussing Rosen's murder and later survived an attempt on his own life. After only hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. For the very first time, one of the most powerful crime bosses in America had been convicted for ordering a killing. Years of appeals followed, but none succeeded. On March the 4th, 1944, Lepke Buchalter, one of the most powerful mob bosses in America, was executed alongside Mendy Weiss and Louis Capone. In a single night, 3 of Murder Inc.'s central architects were erased. The syndicate that had once functioned as an invisible army of contract killers was finally decapitated. Its leaders were either dead or buried behind prison walls. Lepke was buried at Mount Hebron Cemetery in Queens, forever marking the only time in US history that a reigning Mafia boss was executed by the state. With the executions of Lepke, Weiss, Capone, Bugsy, Happy, Abendando and Harry, Murder Inc., the syndicate's once unstoppable enforcement arm, was effectively destroyed. Some of its members fled, others vanished into small-time rackets, and a few managed to survive by becoming informants themselves. But the era of gangs of professional contract killers operating in the open was over. Even so, the collapse of Murder Inc. did not end the violence that it had helped create. Some of its most powerful architects remained untouched for years, including the man who had directed the Italian wing of the Killing Bureau, Albert Anastasia. After Rellis died on the hotel ledge, the case against Anastasia disintegrated, and the most feared man in New York City walked free. Anastasia thrived in the vacuum left by Lepke's death. He expanded his reach inside the five families, eventually muscling his way into the top job of the newly renamed Gambino family, making him one of the most powerful mafia bosses in America. But power only brought him time, not safety. Anastasia's brutal impulses eventually alienated the powerful men inside the commission, who feared that his recklessness, like sanctioning unauthorized killings, could bring even more heat down on everyone. Together, they approved a move that had once been unthinkable: the murder of the man who had overseen the syndicate's deadliest years. On the morning of October the 25th, 1957, Anastasia sat in the barber's chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel at 202 West 56th Street in Manhattan. Three gunmen rushed in and opened fire. Anastasia jumped up in shock, swung at the mirror thinking it was one of the gunmen, and then collapsed to the floor where they left him dead in a pool of blood. The killing was swift, decisive and symbolic. The last remaining pillar of Murder Inc. had finally fallen. Harry Strauss entered history as one of the deadliest killers the American underworld ever produced, but his death and the dismantling of the murder machine he served marked something larger. The days of a murder-for-hire hit squad were no more. Thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing if you want to see more content. And once again, thanks a lot for watching. I hope you enjoyed the tale of Pittsburgh Phil, aka Harry Strauss, and I shall see you in the next one.